Hi guys, welcome to your video lecture. So here's how you're going to find your notes today. Again, they are guided notes in an electronic format. If you are face-to-face with me, I have a notebook for you, and you are welcome to do them pencil paper. But if you are not, here is how we're going to operate electronically. So just like last time, your fossil notes, again, are guided notes. You're going to type in here what you're missing in the blanks. Make sure, again, you file, make your own copy, change the share settings. Otherwise, let's get going. So today's lecture is all about fossils. We're going to go through the different kinds of fossils, and we're going to go through how they're made and what they tell us. So it's going to be a pretty awesome day. So how do we know Earth's history? We talked about Earth's history, so the different periods, the time periods that we studied, the eons, the eras, the periods, and the epochs. So we talked about how scientists know. One of the ways is by studying the rocks and the fossils and other natural evidence for clues about Earth's history. Fossils are good, easy definitions, are traces of animals, or traces, not just animals, plants too, traces of living things and single-celled organisms like protists. Just a little misconception we got to clear up, that life is more than just the big things you see. It's the tiny things as well, like bacteria, protists, and viruses. Okay, but anyways, fossils are traces or remains of living things from long, long ago. They can include bones, like dinosaur bones, or footprints, and they give information about the organism, often extinct about the organism that we're studying, but not always. They allow us to have some idea about what they look like and how they behave. Some of it we have created with our own minds or other connections. So we're pulling information from all of these different sources to kind of get an idea of what these things look like. They exist in many different forms. They could be shells, bones, or teeth. They could be impressions or other evidence of organisms in preserved rocks. Or they could be the actual organism or part of one can be preserved. So we're going to go through all of these different ones again and study them. Continuing on. So what are original remains? So this is part of our study. These are really rare. They're fossils of organisms, actual bodies or body parts. Really rare. They're also called preserved fossils. That's because a lot of the times what's left behind for us in a fossil is actually the hard parts of an organism. So we're losing that skin or like the eyes, like think skeleton, like Terry over here. We don't have often the eyes or the skin, but we can find actual original remains, which is awesome. They're found often in airtight spaces because air is sometimes what can cause a body to decompose along with the bacteria or fungus that's decomposing it. In small spaces that prevent decay. So you've got to have these right conditions that allow for the organism to survive. You don't want it to decay. One of those is ice, and it's one of our best preservers. We found frozen mammoth bodies in Siberia with bone, muscle, skin, and hair still in place. So that's really rare, specifically the hair and like the feathers of a dinosaur. Did you know that they've recently found the remains of a dinosaur and saw that it had feathers on it, which is something that people did not know before. So we're conceptualizing our idea of dinosaurs from the scaly reptiles that you had once thought of to maybe something that looked more along the lines of a giant chicken with some scales on it, right? So we're constantly building our ideas and changing them based on the evidence that we have. That's part of science. But anyways, ice is one way. Amber is another. That's tree sap or resin. It's a sticky substance that flows into trees like syrup and protects the tree by trapping insects. Tar is another one. So animals get trapped in pools of tar and are preserved, like our saber-toothed tiger skull that we will hopefully see a picture of in a second. But fossils are direct evidence of forms of life, like dinosaurs. So direct evidence, whereas our traces are... we'll talk about it in a second. There's another word for it. I just can't quite remember right now. But anyways, that's fossils in a nutshell. An original remains. So like our amber, you can often find insects because they're attracted to the sticky sap to eat, trapped in that, and find the organisms. As far as tar goes, though, there are, what are they called? Peat. Peat, it's kind of like a swamp, but it's not. It's really carbon-based. And ancient people used to sacrifice humans into there, and animals. And because it was airtight, it would trap the body and would have the remains. I'll look up a picture at the end of the lecture to show you this. But how are fossils formed? So they're formed in rocks, typically. The conditions must be just right for it to be preserved before it decays. Body parts are replaced by minerals or turned into stone, and most organisms die and decompose without leaving fossils because their conditions, they're not just right. So our hard parts, shells, bones, teeth, decompose slowly, so they're more likely to become fossils. More often than not, if you find a fossil, it's going to be some part of a hard part of an organism that you find. Excuse me. They are most often found in sedimentary rocks. Their organisms are they're always found in sedimentary rocks because of the way that igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks form, but organisms are buried in sediments and then the sediments become rock. That's how we get our fossils in sedimentary rocks. The heat and pressure, so specifically the heat of igneous rocks or melted magma and lava, is going to destroy any kind of evidence that was in it. And metamorphic rocks form from intense pressure and intense heat. So that is often going to destroy any organic evidence in it, meaning that for the most part, almost without question, our fossils are found in sedimentary rocks or the layered rocks. Not all fossils are original remains, but impressions tracks made of rock. And I do believe we are going to talk about that. So this enters the part of your notes that doesn't have any blanks. So for this, I would like you to highlight any word that is defined. So we have 4 different types of fossils. The first one that we're going to talk about are molds and casts, and they are molds and casts, they're 2 different ones. But the different types of fossils are because they form from different things. Or they have different conditions that form them. So molds form when sediments bury an organism and the sediments change into rocks. The organism decays, leaving a hole in the rock in the shape of the organism. So that's a mold. A cast can form when a mold is filled with sand or mud that hardens into the shape of an organism. That's a cast. Similar to how like the dentist might make a mold of your teeth and then make a cast of your teeth. It's the same kind of thing except happening over millions of years. So a mold is when sediments bury an organism and then the sediments change into rock, but then that organism decays, leaving a hole in the rock, the shape of the organism. Cast is when something fills it and becomes a rock. We also have petrified fossils, so they form when minerals soak into the buried remains, changing them into rock. So there's the National Petrified Wood Forest, which is pretty cool, and it's illegal to steal the petrified wood. Once upon a time I had a petrified wood sample. If I can find it, I'll bring it in to show you guys, but I don't know where I put it. And then you can also have a stone fossil of a tree. So that's pretty cool. Let's see if we can find some pictures of those, because those are pretty interesting. Okay, first we've got molds. So again, the mold was where the organism was there, and then it decayed, and it left an impression in the rock. A cast is when the sediment fills that mold and becomes rock itself. So these are casts. This is an example of petrified fossils. So you can see how what was once living became rock. So that's because the minerals soak into the buried remains and change them into rock. So we've got some fish there and what looks like a tetrapod lizard. Okay, another of our 4 types, so this is our third and fourth. Debatably, I think molds and casts was one group, so there might be 5, depending on how you look at it. But our carbon films are another example. So these form when an organism or parts are pressed between layers of soft mud or clay that harden, squeezing almost all the decaying organism away, leaving the carbon imprint in the rock. This shows details of soft parts rarely seen in other types of fossils, so this is pretty cool and pretty rare. So again, when you're highlighting, I expect you to highlight molds, casts, petrified fossils, carbon films, and then trace fossils. Trace fossils are evidence of organisms' presence, so footprints, trails, animal holes. We can find these as well. Here's some trace fossils, and here's some carbon films. So remember, it's when dead organisms are first squeezed between a rock. This leaves the carbon imprint of the organism into the rock. Oftentimes, these are found with plant matter because they are so small and so able to squish, but not always. They can happen with animal matter as well. So you don't have any questions in your notes. We're just going to move on to our other page here. Again, we've got some highlighting to do. Please do that. So our question here is, how can we see changes in life in the environment? One way we can do this is by looking at the fossil record. So millions of fossils have been collected and observed. Scientists are really good at collecting data and categorizing it and sharing it with other people, for the most part. Certain fossilized organisms could only live in specific environments or under particular climate conditions. So because they have that specialized environment and climate, and you'll also learn time, we can identify a time at which this organism lived or a condition. So if I were to find, for example, a fossil of a seashell or a trilobite, like we learned in the other lectures, which was an ancient organism found in the Paleozoic era that lived and thrived under the warm, shallow water conditions, and I found one outside of Emeru when we were digging through a dirt pile, I could assume that at one point in the Earth's history, this part of the state or the world was covered in that water because I found a trilobite fossil. Extinctions of life forms, as well as how and when new life appeared, is also part of the fossil record. So in the fossil record, we can see when organisms started to evolve, when big groups of organisms, remember we talked about how in the Mesozoic era, angiosperms or flowering plants and gymnosperms or seed-bearing plants became first prevalent. We know that because of the fossil record. And we also know when organisms passed away. So like our ancient ancestor of the tetrapod, which was amphibious and became a land animal, that became extinct. Or even like our woolly mammoths, we can track when those became extinct, or any of our ancient life that's not with us anymore. Tree rings are also a way to see and track the changes in the environment over time. So we can see overall weather patterns in an area because of the tree rings. Rings vary in size depending on how much the tree grows that year. If you cut down a tree and you see that its rings are really close together, they're thin rings, and there's lots of them, you can suspect that when those rings were formed, that it was a dry year. When we had good rainfall or weather, the tree was able to grow a lot, so it has a thick growth ring. Pretty cool, right? And again, if you didn't know, the number of rings that you count on a tree is how old the tree actually is. So that's pretty interesting. Again, please highlight tree rings and fossil record on your note sheet. I would also know highlight this sentence right here. Certain fossilized organisms can only live in a specific environment under particular climate conditions. We're just going to have to ignore that because I don't know how to pause this, so it's fine. All right, moving on. So we can also see certain environmental conditions based on our ice cores. So we can take samples of the ice, which has been formed for thousands of years, and that can show the change in the climate. So Greenland and Antarctica, ice and snow has built up into thick layers called glaciers. They can be as tall as skyscrapers, or they can be little. Ice cores, which are taking a cylinder sample that shows the layers of snow and ice that have built up for thousands of years, right? So we can find a really thick one, or we can see the change. We can do similar samples of the soil out here and kind of look at our soil layers, which we'll do when we're in Earth and Environmental. We can't, unfortunately, take an example of an ice core because we don't live in Greenland or Antarctica, but maybe we can watch a video